A graveyard for children. That is how Gaza was described this week by my guest, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He is just one of the UN officials sounding the alarm on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The human rights chief called it a living nightmare. The head of the UN's relief agency has said hell is settling in there. And the leader of the World Health Organization told the Security Council on Friday that in the Strip, nowhere and no one is safe. So, what can the UN do to stop it? Secretary General Guterres joins me now. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me ask you to begin with. Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was just on CNN and he says, quote, "I'd like to see the UN Secretary General, who basically laid the blame on Israel, lay the blame on these savages to demand that they obey international law because Israel is fighting according to international law." What is your reaction?
Well, that's simply not true. I mean, when you are in the UN and you face a situation that is as horrible and as messy as this is, you must stick to principles. And since the very beginning, I have condemned Hamas. What Hamas did is horrific. Terror attacks, slaughtering women and children. And I've been very clear in the condemnation of Hamas. But there is a basic principle for me, is that Hamas is not the Palestinian people. And you need to be able to distinguish Hamas from the Palestinian people. And so you cannot use the horrific things that Hamas did as a reason for a collective punishment of the Palestinian people. And then there is a second dimension that I believe is very important. And what I've been saying has been completely distorted. And I've been saying there are grievances of the Palestinian people. Of course there are.
You said, let me quote you, you said, it's important to recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. So tell us what is the context?
Of course there are grievances. Grievances related to 56 years of occupation and the settlements being constructed, the evictions, the progressive lack of hope of the Palestinian people that there will be a two-state solution. But in the same sentence I said, but none of these grievances justify the barbaric attack of Hamas. And it's very interesting because when this is commented by the Israeli government or the ambassador or whatever, they put the first part of the sentence, but they take out the second part of the sentence. And obviously, the barbaric attacks of Hamas do not justify the collective punishment of the Israeli people. And the grievances of the Palestinian people do not justify the barbaric attacks of Hamas. We must stick to principles. And another principle, if I may, I mean, in the face of God, the life of any person has the same value, be it American, Portuguese, Israeli, or Palestinians.
Do you believe that the siege, cutting off food, electricity, fuel, and these bombardments, this is effectively collective punishment of 2.2 million people? Well,
the truth is that we have witnessed in the Israeli response in Gaza unrelented bombardments, and we are seeing a dramatic number of civilian casualties. And the international humanitarian law is clear. International humanitarian law forbids to take hostages, and I strongly appeal for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages by Hamas. And I've always been very clear on that. International humanitarian law says that human shields should not be used by parties, and I strongly condemn the fact that Hamas uses human shields. But international humanitarian law also gives a primacy to the protection of civilians, and this is what is not happening. You mentioned the graveyard of children, that expression that I used. Now, as you probably know, every year I publish a report about children killed and maimed and victims of conflict. And the countries that do it are listed. And this usually generates a polemic. Remember the past situations of Saudi Arabia, of Israel, of Russia, etc. Now, in the 7 years I've been Secretary General, in the reports that have been presented, the maximum number of children killed during 1 year by any party to the conflict was about 600. 600 by the Taliban in one of the years, 600 by the Syrian government and their allies in another of the years. If you remember the polemics about the uproar about the Saudi bombardments in Yemen, 300 people in 1 year. Now, I'm not going to enter into discussions about the accuracy of the numbers provided by the de facto authorities that exist in Gaza, but it is clear that the number of children killed in a few weeks in Gaza is in the thousands. Now, it is clear that the protection of civilians that is paramount in international humanitarian law is not paramount in the strategy that is being applied by the military operations in Gaza.
Why do you think the Israelis are not making that a primacy objective?
I mean, because the logic has been, in many situations, to raise neighborhoods, and I presume this is to facilitate the movement of troops or for any other reason. But the question is the protection of civilians that is required is not there. And then the second aspect in international humanitarian law is that you must guarantee unrestricted access to humanitarian aid to all areas where the conflict is taking place. And what we have seen until now is a drop by drop in the increase of humanitarian aid. Up to today, we have about 900 trucks in these 22 days, 930-something trucks. Before, in the past, there were 500 trucks every day supplying Gaza. You can imagine what this means in relation to water, in relation to medicine, in relation to food, in relation to... And fuel is not authorized. And that is why in many hospitals we have problems with incubators, you have problems with dialysis, you have lack of anesthesia, and many other things that transform this situation in really an extremely horrendous situation for the people of Gaza. And as I said, you cannot make a confusion between Hamas, that you must condemn, and the people of Gaza that you must protect.
Stay with us, Mr. Secretary General. When we come back, I'm going to ask the Secretary General what the solutions are. How do we get out of this? How do we create some degree of peace and stability in the area? When I come back. And we are back with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Mr. Secretary General, when this Israeli campaign is over, first of all, let me ask you, how long has the Israeli government given any indication of how long this will go on? At what point will they feel that they have cleared out the space enough to feel like they've rooted out Hamas?
The only honest answer is that I have no idea.
And when it gets done, presumably there will be the question of who governs Gaza. A lot of people are going to want the UN to get involved at that point.
Well, I think we need to work for what could be a best case scenario. I mean, usually politicians transform opportunities into problems. I hope that it will be possible to transform this problem into an opportunity. The best case scenario would be that a reinvigorated Palestinian Authority would be able to assume the leadership also in Gaza, and then that Israel would accept to seriously negotiate a two-state solution with the support of the international community. That is the best case scenario. For the best case scenario to be possible, the question of how does the military operation ends and how is the establishment of an authority by the Palestinian Authority is the complex one. And that is where a transition is necessary. I understand it will be very difficult for a Palestinian Authority or for a group of Arab countries to come to assume responsibilities in Gaza in the presence of an Israeli army. I understand the difficulty. Politically, it will be very sensitive. So how to organize the transition is something that is very important. And I have to say that there is a country that, in my opinion, has particular capacity and particular responsibility to contribute to it, and that is the United States of America. And I have to pay tribute, independently of many other aspects, in relation to putting pressure on Israel for humanitarian aid to be delivered in Gaza. The US has been consistently in support of that.
Do you think, though, the UN could play a part in that transition? Because you're right, I can't imagine that the Palestinian Authority or Arab countries would be willing to, as it were, go in on the back of Israeli tanks and say, we are now the government of Gaza. Is there a role for the UN in a transitional? Would you be willing to do something like that?
I mean, I don't see a UN protectorate in Gaza, but the international community needs to come together, and the UN can play a part on that. The international community needs to come together to find a transition that is acceptable to Israel from the point of view of the guarantee of security of Israel. And I understand the concerns of security of the State of Israel, but at the same time, that allows for the transfer to an effective Palestinian Authority. How this transition is organized, it's not obvious at the present moment. I think it will have to involve the whole of the international community, of course, the countries of the region, the UN, the US, but it is essential to make it happen, and it's essential to take profit of this situation to finally create the possibility of a two-state solution. I don't believe there is any other solution. What would be a one-state solution with such a large number of Palestinian people inside that state without any rights? That would be inconceivable. So the two-state solution is, in my opinion, the only way out. To build the two-state solution, Israel must understand that they have to accept it, which is not obvious at the present moment. But at the same time, we need to create the conditions of a transition that gives Israel the guarantees that their security will not be put into question. Now, the modus faciendi is complex. We have not a solution here just in the pocket, but I am ready to put the UN at the service of the international community for what needs to be a multi-stakeholder involvement to allow for the best case scenario to be possible. Because the worst case scenario we need to avoid at all costs. And the worst case scenario would be Gaza to be transformed into a permanent nightmare, the two-state solution to be buried, and the peace in the Middle East to be lost forever.
Do you worry about an escalation in Lebanon, in other places?
I'm very worried. First of all, in the West Bank, where things are getting worse by the day and where we are witnessing levels of violence that are extremely dangerous. But of course, the most complex situation that we face is in relation to Lebanon. We have been very active in doing everything we can with those that can have influence over the parties, both Hezbollah and Israel, to make sure that having the level
Have you spoken to Iran? Because they have a lot of...
I have spoken to Iran, and I've asked two things to Iran. One is to put pressure on Hamas to have the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and second, to tell Hezbollah, you cannot create a situation in which Lebanon will be completely engulfed by this conflict. Because if Hezbollah will launch a massive attack on Israel, it might create, I don't know what kind of impact. But one thing I'm sure, Lebanon would not survive.
Do the Iranians seem responsive to that?
I do not know.
They did not?
They said always that they have nothing to do what is happening, but they say publicly that there is a risk of this conflict to be extended. So, it's always very mysterious, the position of Iran. But we have talked to Hezbollah, and we are in close contact with the Lebanese authorities. And as I said, we must do everything to avoid an escalation of the confrontation that would be a massive offensive of Hezbollah with a massive response of Israel, in which Lebanon would be completely destroyed.
Final thought on, you have lost 100 UN employees in
101.
Gaza. 101.
As of today.
Is it your sense that now UN personnel are out of harm's way?
No, on the contrary, the numbers are growing by the day. You can imagine what it is to run an organization in which 101 people that was working purely to help address the humanitarian needs of the people, 101 people being killed. And some of them killed with their families in their houses by bombardment. So this is very difficult for us. We will have across the organization next Monday 1 minute of silence. Our flags will be at half mast. But of course, I mean, I mourn all the Israelis that were killed by Hamas. I mourn all the Palestinians that are dying. But as you can imagine, I mean, we are a family, and we feel very dramatically those of our family that die. And you can imagine how difficult it is for me to tell our colleagues that they must go on in this very dangerous situation.
Antonio Guterres, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.